fourth session or lesson that we've had on husbands, even though I know husbands, we didn't even deal with it in the very first lesson. We talked about the blessings of marriage and how marriage blesses society in general. And so that was what we wrote in. If you recall, we wrote it in on page 4 on that first blank page. But we're looking today at the husband's responsibilities to his wife. And so the opening illustration, of course, this dates it a little bit. But by the way, if you ever take a notion to write Bible class literature, don't tie it in time to historical events. Look, this says the space shuttle Discovery was grounded recently. Well, it's like you could have just said was grounded and moved on, and you wouldn't have dated the material to that time. I got to tell you this. It reminded me when I first took the work at East Wood Street in Paris. One of my jobs was to handle the curriculum for all the kids, from the cradle roll all the way up. Now it was already kind of in place, but they were using the Living Way material, which has been good material for decades. But I got the first lesson book for my junior high class on the Living Way, and the opening illustration in the lesson was some reference to the Vietnam War. And I'm like, this is 1994. Most of their parents weren't even, old enough hardly to know a whole lot about the Vietnam War. And I thought, man, this is not the way to write materials. Don't date yourself. Just find a generic illustration. But this illustration is good insofar as it illustrates for us the need for husbands to be diligent in their I will use the term maintenance, or the maintaining of their marriages. And it says that the Discovery was grounded not by technical difficulties, but by woodpeckers. It said, it listed the woodpeckers had found the insulating foam on the shuttle's external fuel tank irresistible material for pecking. But the foam is critical for the shuttle's performance. And without it, ice forms on the tank. And when it's filled with the super cold fuel, ice can break free during liftoff, damage the spacecraft, and the shuttle was grounded until the damage was repaired. Now, with that in mind, open your Bibles to the book of the Song of Solomon, chapter 2. The Song of Solomon, chapter 2. And as you're turning to chapter 2, I'm going to read the next paragraph in this lesson. It says, marriages are frequently damaged not only by the big things, perhaps like infidelity or abuse or abandonment, but also by the little things. Criticism, lack of leadership, breakdown in communication can peck away at the relationship and keep it from becoming what God intended it to be. And I'm really surprised that this verse was not included in this particular paragraph, but it's in chapter 2 and verse number 15. And in the midst of this book of poetry, which pictures a husband or at least a potential husband and his future bride. It says in verse number 15, it says, catch us the foxes, the little foxes that spoil the vines, for our vines have tender grapes. And the lesson here, the meaning here, and by the way, you can see this in any type of agricultural or horticultural endeavor, is that even the slightest bit of damage to the vine ruins the result of fruit bearing. In this case, we're in the picture here is that the grapes are in their early stages. Right? Well, which means they're in the stage where the vine is pouring absolutely all that it can pour into the production of fruit. Okay? And that any damage to the vine, like a little fox chewing on that vine, then diverts the resources that should be going to the bearing of fruit to repair the damage that's done by these little foxes scratching or biting at the base of the vine. And the point is that the fox doesn't have to chew the vine in two. He doesn't have to chew it all the way down to the ground in order to spoil the fruit that's ongoing, or that is growing and anticipated. I'll give you a real life example of this. John and Tammy are tomato canners of the highest order. And the tomatoes that they grow, John, I don't know if you grow any indeterminate tomatoes. I just know he grows mostly determinate tomatoes. And when you're buying tomatoes, there's a difference between a determinate tomato and an indeterminate tomato. An indeterminate tomato is a tomato that produces all through the growing season. From the time it starts producing, it's going to put on just bits of fruit all along the growing season until the frost. A determinate plant puts all of its fruit on at one time. And that's the type of unless you just want to grow 1 million tomato plants, if you want to can tomatoes, you want to plant determinate tomatoes that put on all at the same time. I mean that plant's just you're not going to get any before it, and you're not going to get any after. It's all going to come in at one time, and that thing's just going to look like a red pillar. It's going to have so many tomatoes on it. But here's the problem. If somebody comes along, now that determinate tomato might put on 2 or 3, early bits of fruit ahead of the massive fruit. If somebody comes and picks those early 2 or 3 or 4 tomatoes while the rest of them are putting on, it'll ruin the whole thing. It'll ruin the whole thing. And look, you're not even, like in your mind, you're like, well, I'm not damaging the plant. I'm just getting these early tomatoes off, right? It ruins the whole thing. And so just by picking early fruit, you can ruin you can ruin the whole crop. And by the way, that happened to John one year. Somebody slipped in. We're not calling any names. Wasn't me. All right. We're not calling names because it was me. All right. It wasn't me. But somebody slipped in, picked a few handfuls of early fruit, and ruined it. On those plants for the rest of the season. That's what Solomon is talking about here, and that's the illustration. That's the illustration for us in marriage. Is that most marriages are not ruined by the big things. They're ruined by the small things. In other words, things happen in our marriages that ought not take place, and then eventually it leads to the ruin of the entire marriage. You don't have a couple that has a great marriage, and everything's hunky-dory, on Monday, and then on Tuesday the husband decides he's just going to step out on his wife. It doesn't work that way. Those things kind of accrue and build up until you get to a major situation. And so the lesson for us is that we have to, as the Song of Solomon says in verse 2:15, or in the illustration that I use, because tomatoes are also vines, so it works in that sense, is that we have to tend to the vines and guard against any kind of damage so that the vine can produce the fruit it's intended to produce. And it's the husband's job to take the lead in this matter. I mean, that's what the Bible tells us about the job of the husband's job is to protect his wife, but in so doing, he protects his marriage. But there's more to protecting one's wife than just setting up cameras outside your house to make sure intruders don't come, or putting up a ring camera, or providing firearms, or building a gate around the house. There's more to protecting the wife than just those things, and that's what we want to think about. We want to think about guarding the vines. All right, and the first is in number 1 is bottom of page 15 is the husband is to honor and value his wife. That's the baseline for the whole thing. If you're a vine grower, if you're a tomato grower, the value you place on your crop is going to determine how you conduct yourself toward that crop. How much attention do you pay? How closely do you look? Are you looking for damage? Are you guarding for pests? Are you providing the things that are needed for growth and development? And it all goes back to honoring and valuing the wife. Now, look, I don't know if this is a true story, but it is a good illustration. This illustration about Will Rogers being invited says just a party, and the invitation was directed to him. And so it says he went to the party and he entertained at the party, and when he left, he sent the inviter an invoice for $1,000. And the objection was made that you were invited as a guest, and the retort was, if I'm invited by myself without Mrs. Rogers, then that's work. That's work. If I'm invited as a guest, you invite both of us. You don't just invite me. And so, but the point was, he valued the companionship of his wife, and he rebuked others who did not share in that valuation. On the top of page 16, in the middle of that opening paragraph on the right hand side there, next to the text box, it says the word translated honor means to esteem highly another, or to show esteem to another. So when husbands honor and value their wives, they esteem them highly through their actions and through their words. All right, now let's look at the text that's going to be referenced here in 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse number 7. 1 Peter 3 and verse number 7. It's interesting when Paul writes about husbands and wives in Ephesians 5, he spends a little bit of time talking about wives, and then a massive amount of times, comparatively speaking, talking to husbands, and then he comes right back around at the end and talks to wives again. Peter here spends 6 verses talking to wives, and only 1 verse talking to husbands. But man, what he says in that 1 verse, he says, husbands likewise, dwell with your wives with understanding, giving honor to the wife as to the weaker vessel, as being heirs together of the grace of life, that your prayers be not hindered. Now, look at the wording here. Dwell with them, your wives, with understanding. Now, I think sometimes we miss that opening line. Dwell with your wives with understanding. So many times our marriages are fractured because we're all going in different directions all the time. Husbands have their jobs and wives have their jobs, and there's things to be done and places to go and people to see, and even our children can divide us, not in so much as dividing our loyalties, but divide us just by proximity. One parent's got kids over here, and another parent's got kids over here, and look. You've probably heard me joke that that even without our kids, sometimes Rhonda and I just barely, at times we just barely see one another, or it seems that way to me sometimes. And there's a very real. I'm trying to figure out how to say this. My travel schedule has lightened immensely this year. Instead of having 7, appointments, gospel meetings and whatnot, and being gone for 4, 5, 6, 7 days at a time, 8, I'm looking forward to being at home. And by the way, she'll tell you this. I'm getting terrible in my old age about, I made mention, I'll go to Walmart with her just to go. I got no business at Walmart, but she's going to go to Walmart. I'm going to go. I'm not just going to sit. And it's nice to be able to be. It's nice to be able to be together. And so there's the idea that we need to be together. We need to be together. Live together. Not just sharing an address, but sharing your lives together. Dwell with your wives. And it says, dwell with them with understanding. In other words, be wise, be smart, be attentive, be discerning, be watchful. All the things that go with having or living with someone with understanding. So dwell with them with understanding. Give honor to the wife. And then, and I know that this next line rubs feminists the wrong way, but so be it. It says, as the weaker vessel. We live in a world now that just projectile vomits this idea that men and women are equal in every way. That's the best way I know how to describe it. It's the dumbest, most foolish thing that's ever been perpetrated, perhaps on our entire society, until they decided that boys can be girls and girls can be boys. Which, by the way, is nothing more than an extension of men and women are the same, essentially, in every way. The Bible describes the wife as the weaker vessel. All right. Now there are obvious physical manifestations of this. Men and women are not the same physically. Not even close. Not even close. I did a study. It's probably been 3 or 4 years ago now. Of for example, the physical requirements to get into West Point. Because most of y'all know that Judge Bentley and I are really good friends. And John said even back in the 70s, early 70s, when he was at West Point, they were trying to find ways to manipulate the demands to let women into West Point. And he said, because there just wasn't any way. There just wasn't any way. Because if you lowered the standards, then you ended up with a bunch of men that didn't deserve to be there. And so if you go online, you can even see it that men have to run a certain distance at a certain speed, and women are not held to that standard. Men have to do so many pull-ups in order to get into West Point, and women don't have to do any. All they have to do is be able to hang by their hands for a certain length of time. They don't even have to pull themselves up. mean, it's just all the standards, all the physical standards are different. The height and weight standards are different. Why? Because men and women are different. You want to know? You want to know why you don't see women firefighters? The Alabama Fire, was it the Fire Academy or was it Fire College? I think has graduated one woman in the last 30 years, and you know what the number one reason is? The physical demands. The physical demands. Why are there no female Navy SEALs? The physical demands. We are different. When you can take an average male swimmer and he decides he's a woman and he destroys all the female swimming records, you know that men and women are different. When a group of 15-year-old boys from Dallas, Texas, beats the U.S. women's soccer team about 7-0. I'm talking a 15-year-old boy soccer team in Dallas beat the world's best women's soccer team. And didn't just beat them, I mean drubbed them. Drubbed them. We know that men and women are physically different. Right? And so that's one reason why a man's job is to protect, a husband's job is to protect his wife. And I think it even extends beyond. I think it's men's job in general to protect women. Not just your wife, but again, feminists hate that kind of talk, but it's true. It's true. But also, look at the lesson. It says, her finer sensibilities. Her finer sensibilities. In other words, men and women appreciate different things, right? One of the best illustrations I ever heard that really made me think was, when the gold rush was on and primarily men were going out west to make a fortune, digging gold or whatever it was that they were going to do. When you had nothing but men, you didn't have anything out there but tack shops and saloons. But when women started coming, guess what happened? They started building schools and churches. Because women have finer sensibilities than men. Why are there more older women in the churches, single women in the churches, than there are older men? Because they have better sensibilities, right? I mean, it's just a fact. And so there's an appreciation for the finer and delicate things that women have that men generally do not have. Right? And those things have to be appreciated, and they have to be protected. And then you have the more delicately poised emotional nature. Look, men and women are very different emotionally speaking. Again, in their response to various situations, their levels of empathy in various situations, men and women differ greatly in this way. That's one reason why you have so many men at the top of the corporate ladder than you do women. That's why most of your Fortune 500 companies are headed by men as opposed to women. It's why you have far more men in the political spectrum than you do women. Again, because of the emotional makeup that is evident and obvious to most people. And then lastly, it says this: as opposed to her spiritual makeup. In other words, men and women are both to be spiritually minded individuals. In other words, it's not that women are weak spiritually, but they do need to be nurtured and protected in that way. Then second says they're to honor and value their wives because they're created in the image of God. There is an inherent value in all human life, because all humans are made in the image of God. And husband, I don't think anybody denies that, but obviously it's something that we don't think about probably as much as we should. Then you have third, husbands are to honor and value their wives because they are the crown of their husbands, Proverbs 12 and verse 4. A wife is the crown of her husband. By the way, the Bible teaches that a man gets two crowns. He gets the crown of his wife, and he gets the crown of his grandchildren, which is a beautiful crown on top of another beautiful crown. But a wife is described as the crown or the adornment of her husband. And then lastly, in this fourth, husbands are to honor and value their wives because they are a gift from God. And this is where a lot of husbands oftentimes fail in their appreciation for their wives. They fail to see them as a gift from God. Bottom half of page 16. The husband is to provide for his wife. 1 Timothy 5 and verse 8 talks about providing for those. The extended context, or the immediate context, is caring for widows. But it goes without saying that husbands are to provide for their wives. It was Michael Shepard. I've never forgotten it. He said, before God gave Adam a wife, He gave him a place to live and a job. Place to live and a job. In other words, Adam had a place to live in the garden, and God had already given him a job to tend the garden. And then once Adam had those two things, then God decided that he was fit to have a wife. All right? And there's a sense in which Adam failed his wife. He failed his wife. He allowed her to be unduly influenced by the serpent or by the devil. And so, but a husband is to provide the physical needs of a wife. But then look here, it says, this is Willard Harley's book, His Needs, Her Needs. That book probably sold tens of millions of copies. And said that a wife's 5 basic needs are affection, conversation, transparency, financial support, and family commitment. And then there's a lot of things that would probably fall under that large, individually under that large umbrella. Then bottom of page 16, the husband is to protect his wife. And I've never thought about this passage from Nehemiah before. While they were rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem, Sanballat and Tobiah conspired against the Jews to prevent them from building the wall, and so then they had to all arm themselves with swords while they were working as a protective measure while they're working. Which, by the way, that hinders your ability to work if you've got like a sword attached to your side. But it says here, do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord, great and awesome, and fight for your brethren, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your houses. Husbands must be willing to do whatever it takes to protect their wives. And, of course, the illustration is how Jesus provides and protects the church. Then, middle of page 17, the husband is to be faithful to his wife. And oftentimes we short sheet the idea of faithfulness to being simply indicative of being sexually. What's the word? Well, I don't want to use the word faithful to define the word faithful, but we sometimes we talk about faithfulness only in the context of adultery or not being adulterous. But there's a lot more. There's a lot more to being faithful than just that. You have in this text the beginning of that fourth point. Being devotedly supportive, loyal, worthy of trust. reliable. About 7 lines down, you find in where it begins with the word instead. Instead, the wife is to occupy the premier position in her husband's thoughts, times, and affections. The admonition for the husband is to nourish and cherish his wife. That's Ephesians 5:28 and 29. In that text it says, "For no man ever hated his own flesh, but he nourishes it and cherishes it, even as the Lord does the church." And then at the bottom is, "Then the husband must be faithful to his wife morally." And so that's why sometimes we shrink that down to only being that. But if we were to think about it, if we are faithful in all of those other things, then the moral part follows after that. Now, if we're faithful, if we're faithful in a few little things, then we'll be faithful in the big things. And the Bible talks about that. Jesus, there's the parable of the Lord. That, you have been faithful over a few things, I will make you a ruler over many things. If we can be faithful in every aspect of our life, if we can be faithful in the small things, then we can be trusted to be faithful in the big things. If we can be faithful in pennies, we'll be faithful in pounds. If we were in London, that's what you would say. But you understand the principle there. Part number 5 is from 17 and 18. It speaks of the husband is to continually court his wife, and over on page 18 there's a list of questions, and this is an interesting concept. And look, I readily admit my failure in this respect, but there is a very simple principle involved here. Do I dedicate as much time to my wife? And I'm going to use the term dating. Courting is so dated. All right. Do I spend or dedicate as much time to my wife as I did when we were dating? Do I speak the same sweet, complimentary words I did when we were dating? Is my appearance and dress as neat and nice and attractive as it was when we were dating? Do I sit with my wife like I did when we were dating? Do I call her just to hear her voice like I did when we were dating? How many of y'all ever, if any of y'all ever had the long distance, and by long distance I mean you had to call long distance. And by the way, back when I was a kid, if you lived in Hamilton, I guess even Haleville might have been long distance back in the day. But the long distance call, in other words, the one you had to pay for. How many of y'all had, you hang up. No, you hang up. All right, I'm going to count to 3 and we'll hang up. 1, 2, 3. And then nobody hangs up. And all y'all are laughing and smiling because you all know exactly what I'm talking about. By the way, Rhonda has no trouble hanging up on me now. None whatsoever.
Tammy hang up on me when I'm talking to her.
Tammy hang up on you while you're still talking? Did it yesterday? Yeah. But now they'll hold out an excuse. Well, accidentally. But back in the day, you had to literally hang up the phone. That's where by the way, for those of y'all that aren't old enough, that's what hang up means, because you had to hang the phone on the wall. All right. But how many of us have that same idea? She'll tell on herself.
Call her back and she'll explain. She said, "I could hear you, but you couldn't hear me." "No, I heard you. I was answering you." And then she thinks about it for a minute, and then we move on.
What? Which test? Hey, you just settle down. We're going to get to the wives next week. We'll see what Bob has to say. We'll see what Bob has to say. Do I speak with her? Do I walk with her? Do I hold her hand the way? Still open? Do you still open the door? Do you still open the door? I still try to do that for Rhonda. Is open the door for her, getting in the vehicle and whatnot. And then we're back right where we started in number 6 is, we share our lives together. Do I share my life? With my wife. And then top of the page 19 is the husband should work, and I like the use that should work to ensure his wife's happiness. Should work to ensure his wife's happiness. All right. Any thoughts? All right. That brings us to the end of chapter 2. Lord willing, next week we'll start in chapter 3 on page 21. Today's the 15th.